me a favor. If you could got it on.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back. This is session 2 of our course on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to be presenting a lot of information today. Today's content is going to cover the years 1954 up to the beginning of 1963. So it's a 9-year period, but a lot happens in this 9-year period as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X both become figures on the national and then ultimately the international stage by the time we get to the beginning of 1963. We're going to talk about how those foundations that we laid in week 1 come to fruition as they establish themselves as activists, as theologians, as organizers, and as so many other realms, all with the desire to answer the question. Both of them were really asking or attempting to answer the question of how does the black man get liberation in the United States? What does that look like? And this has been a question that the black community, the Afro-descendant community, has asked since enslavement. What does liberation look like? Particularly after slavery was over, that became the question. Is liberation to be found among white Americans and fighting together to make the country better for all? Or is liberation for black people to be found only among black people and black communities separate from white communities? That has always been the dichotomy. What direction does black America take? And Malcolm and Martin in these years between 1954 and 1963 are in different ways attacking that question of what to do and what is the political, economic, and social destiny and spiritual destiny of Africans in America. So let's get into it. 1954, very important year. And as always in our seminars, I'll lecture for about 20, 25 minutes. We'll have a recorded Q&A, and then I'll lecture again, and then we will have open discussion at the end. We probably won't go too long today because I know it's a long weekend for folks, but we will still have that nonetheless. 1954, very important year for both of these men. This was the year that they both become full-time ministers at the churches and mosques, respectively, that would come to define the beginnings of their career. 1954 is the year that Malcolm X becomes the minister of Temple Number 7 in Harlem, New York. And 1954 is also the year that Martin Luther King becomes minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. So King is at this time 25 years old, and Malcolm is 29 years old when they become the young ministers of their respective churches. All right, so let's start with these emerging leaders. So just these images of them. 1954 to 1963 is what we're getting into. Let's zoom out a little bit because we have to talk about the national and international context that they become ministers in. What was going on in America? What was going on in the world? And these events are going to propel their stories into the national and international headlines. First, 1954, 1955, we have Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that said separate but equal, the doctrine that had ruled the United States, particularly in the South, since the end of Reconstruction, since the 1870s. This idea that if you have separate accommodations, if you have a black bathroom and a white bathroom, if you have a white section on the train and a black section on the train, that's completely constitutional. That's okay. as long as the accommodations are equal, which they never were. Whenever there was a black school and a white school, the black school always had the less resources, the rundown books, the broken desk, and all of that. Whenever there was a white water fountain and a black water fountain, the black water fountain was always the one that was malfunctioned and all these things. So it was never equal. But that was the law of the land until Brown versus Board of Education. Of Topeka, Kansas is the full name. So a group of families got together in Topeka, Kansas, and said that they were going to challenge the school segregation policies in Kansas. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that, yeah, actually, separate but equal is a violation of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Law, and public accommodations, schools and transportation and all these things, they cannot be separate. That's unconstitutional. So that made what was going on in the South, what was going on in many places in the Midwest and the North, unconstitutional. So the law had changed. The problem is, just because the law changes doesn't mean it's going to be enforced. So the Supreme Court says these laws are unconstitutional. These laws in Mississippi, Alabama, Kansas, all these places are unconstitutional. Well, it's going to take governors, it's going to take state legislatures and others to actually enforce this law. Now that the court has ruled it's unconstitutional. So now direct action had to be done to enforce this. And this is where King and others are going to come in. But the key thing is, the first thing, the desegregation, Brown versus Board of Education. Expertly argued by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, led by Thurgood Marshall, who becomes a Supreme Court justice later on in his life. March 1955, Claudette Colvin protest, very important. In Montgomery, a 15-year-old unwed young black woman refuses to give up her seat on the bus. Now, many of you might have heard that story in a different way, that, an older woman, Rosa Parks, who's more famous, refused to give up her seat on the bus. Well, that happens months later after Claudette Colvin. But we'll talk about why Claudette Colvin is a name that you may not know, but you do know Rosa Parks. We'll get into that in a minute. But her protest is very key to these events. April 1955, the Bandung Conference. The Bandung Conference. This takes place in Indonesia. It is a meeting of all the what's going to be called the non-aligned countries. By the time we get to 1955, this is 10 years after World War II. You have a crop of Asian, African, and Latin American countries that have now gotten independence. And they're getting independence in the 1950s because the European colonial powers are now weak. Britain is weak, France is weak, those being the big two, because they've been fighting this war with Germany, so on and so forth. So the colonies are now being granted independence, many of them. And this is changing the world order. Because prior to this, you had the League of Nations, but after World War II, you had the creation of the United Nations. And as more and more countries join the United Nations, and these are dark countries, black, brown, and red countries yellow countries join the United Nations, they're getting more power in terms of their numbers in the General Assembly. However, they're also coming into a world where there are two major superpowers. There's the Soviet Union and there's the United States. And both of them want all of these new emerging countries to be on their side in this ideological and then ultimately political battle, economic battle for the future of the world. The United States is offering capitalism. The Soviet Union is offering socialism and communism as a way of development. And these countries are being forced to choose because they're coming out of colonial situations where they're in desperate need of development and development aid. They want to build hospitals, they want to build roads, they want to build infrastructure, they want to take care of their people. And colonialism has created a situation where they were dependent on the former colonizers. The colonizers made that situation. So in order to develop, you had to choose one side or the other. At least that's how it was presented to them. You need to either be in the camp of the United States, capitalism, free trade, markets, all of that, or on the side of the Soviet Union, socialism, communism, that form of development. Well, in 1955, these nations got together and they said, we don't want to choose either one. We're going to work together and we're going to start something called the non-aligned movement. And Malcolm X would talk about this conference a lot because he said everybody was invited to this conference except for the white man. You had Asian countries, you had African countries, you had Latin American countries. The only people that weren't invited was the white man. So very important conference. But this sets the stage for what the world is going to look like in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s. This Cold War between the United States and Russia, which ultimately helps progress the civil rights movement in a way. Because as the United States and Russia are competing with each other for allies in the rest of the world, they're able to throw shots at each other. So the United States will say to other countries, you don't want to mess around with Russia. You don't want to be an ally with the Soviet Union because they commit all types of atrocities. You know, they're killing Jews in the Soviet Union. There's mass executions of their own people, and there's these work camps, and it's just not a good economic system. And by the way, they're atheists and all this stuff. You don't want to be involved with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could go to these countries again, most of which are brown and black and yellow people. And the Soviet Union could say, you don't want to be on the side of the United States. Look at what they're doing to those black citizens. Look at the dogs that they're unleashing on black children and the lynchings and all these things. Why would you want to be associated with that? When you all come to the United States to visit the UN, or you're coming to DC, if you're coming from a newly independent country in Africa, let's say Sudan, and you try to get a seat at a restaurant in DC, they might think you are a black American and you won't get served. This happened a lot to African diplomats in the US. So the Soviet Union is able to point these other countries and say, hey, don't mess with the United States. Look what they're doing to brown people in their own country. Because of that, the United States was very conscious of its international reputation and wanted to have these relationships with these new countries for their resources and their markets, so on and so forth. So because of that, the United States wanted to make sure that the civil rights that black folks were struggling for would at least be honored and legally on paper, because that way the Soviet Union couldn't point to these things as reasons why the U.S. was unfit to lead the world. So you had the Bandung Conference. August 1955, the murder of Emmett Till, the vicious murder of the 14-year-old Emmett Till. Emmett Till had gone from his home in Chicago to visit his family in Mississippi. Emmett Till was with his cousins at a store, and there was a white woman in the store. And according to testimony and things, Emmett Till, who's from the North, told his cousins, or his cousin either bet him or he bet his cousins that he wouldn't say anything to this white woman. And Emmett Till says something like, hey, baby, or something like that to this white lady. Well, the white lady goes home. She tells her husband and others that this young black man said something to her, accosted her, this, that, and the third. Emmett Till is taken from his family's home in Mississippi in the middle of the night. He's beaten, he's killed, and his body is tied and thrown into a river. When his body is recovered and everything, his mother has an open casket funeral for Emmett Till. And magazines from around the country, newspapers around the country are there, and they take pictures of this mutilated body of this young 14-year-old boy who was killed. And this sparked off massive protests. And this is one of the catalysts for the civil rights movement. Just like the murder of George Floyd was a catalyst, just like the murder of Trayvon Martin, murders of Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, so many other names that we can mention, on and on and on and on, little Bobby Hutton, on and on and on. This did something to the black community throughout the United States. Seeing this image of this 14-year-old boy mutilated and killed for basically doing nothing, doing what 14-year-olds do. So that spurred the black community into a new form of activism and radicalism all over the country. Last but not least, 1955 Rosa Parks protest. Rosa Parks was a older middle class member of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refused to give up her seat the same way that Claudette Colvin did. The difference is the leadership in Birmingham at the time felt that Rosa Parks was a better image to get behind the support than Claudette Colvin, because Claudette Colvin was 15-year-old unwed mother. They thought that Rosa Parks, being an older, established woman, was the better symbol for this protest. So when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus and was arrested, then the community said, all right, the leaders in the community said, all right, now it's time for action. And we're going to need leaders in the community to help organize Black Montgomery for the action that we want. And Dr. King is going to be one of these leaders. But let's go back. So this is the context in the early years that these men begin their ministries. Spreading Elijah's message. 1954, as I mentioned, Malcolm becomes the minister of Temple number 7 in Harlem, New York. This is not the first temple that he is a minister for. So let's go back a little bit. Malcolm gets out of prison in 1952. He goes first back to Detroit. Now, at this time, the Nation of Islam is not as big, and it's basically centered out of Detroit and Chicago. This is where the followers of Elijah Muhammad are. They're in Detroit and they're in Chicago. And the Little family, Malcolm's brothers and sisters that are joining the Nation of Islam, are a key element of the group in Detroit. Malcolm goes back to Detroit. Malcolm actually gets a job working for Ford Motor Company when he gets out of jail. And he's working, but he's also continuing his studies of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is so impressed by Malcolm that he invites him to Chicago, where the headquarters of the Nation of Islam is and where Elijah Muhammad's personal residence is. And he personally tutors Malcolm X. And Malcolm would study for months and months and months with Elijah Muhammad the theology of the Nation of Islam, that the black man is the righteous man, the white man is the devil, that in order for black people to survive in this country and to thrive, they need to separate completely from white folks. And then the other key element of the nation's theology is they don't turn the other cheek. If threatened, if attacked, members of the Nation of Islam have the right to self-defense. That was another key element. So all of these teachings Malcolm is learning, and he's learning how to administer a temple. The practices of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam had a women's section and a men's section, just like Garvey's organization. The FOI, the Fruit of Islam, was the men's organization. It was it was a paramilitary organization where you had captains and lieutenants, and there was a strict discipline associated with members of the Fruit of Islam. You learned martial arts. You learned how to be a man, how to run your household, how to dress, how they dressed immaculately, how to do all these things. It was military discipline. The women's section, how to run your house as a woman, how to cook, how to be a nurse, how to do all these things. They had classes for children. So Malcolm learned how a temple was supposed to be set up administratively, how everything was supposed to work. So he's learning all this. And then finally, Elijah Muhammad says in 1954, early 1954, you are ready to become a minister and to spread my message. So I want you to go back to Boston and start spreading my message, because there was a small group that was already associated with the nation in Boston. So Malcolm goes back to Boston. Remember, this is where he was arrested. This is where he was living his life as a street hustler. He goes to Boston. He begins preaching Elijah Muhammad's message and organizing the mosque, first out of somebody's living room. And they would invite people in, and he would tell them about Elijah Muhammad's message, how it cleaned him up, how this message is the true religion for black folks. And more people would come and they would hear this young man preach. And the living room would fill up. And then the people in the living room would bring a friend the next week, and it would fill up. And eventually, after 3 months, Malcolm was so effective as organizing and spreading Elijah Muhammad's message that they were now able to buy a little storefront and start a temple in Boston. After that, he was assigned to Philadelphia. So he goes from Boston to Philadelphia. He does the same thing. Starts off, small group of people, spreading the message, recruiting. 3 months later, they're able to get their own temple, and then he moves on. And then finally, after that, after New York, Elijah Muhammad says, I want you to go to Harlem. So Malcolm's life has come full circle. He's arrested for his activities in Boston, for running into people's houses and burglarizing and all that. And also he was running the streets in New York. Now he's going back to the same hoods that he was a thug in and is now a minister. And because he had that experience, because he had that foundation that we talked about last week, his mother being a scholar and an activist and a columnist, his father being an organizer and a minister, that foundation was still there. So he basically was doing the same thing his father did for Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X did for Elijah Muhammad. He set up temples all over the country, but starting in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. He would do something called fishing because his main targets were Black folks that were Christian, and he tailored his message to them. His father was a Baptist minister, so he knew the Bible. He restudied everything when he was in prison and with Elijah Muhammad. So he would wait outside of Black churches. And a lot of these churches were people that had come up from the South, because in these areas that he's operating in, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, a lot of the Black community there are first or second generation folks that came up from the South looking for work. So he knew how to talk to these people. And they would come out of church and he was like, look, you've been in church praying to a white Jesus. And that's who was up in most of these Black churches at this time. We're talking about the 1950s. They're in church. There's the picture of Jesus as a white man. And he says, look, you're in there praying to this white Jesus and you're foaming at the mouth and you're getting the spirit. But then when you come out, what are you doing? You're working as a chauffeur. You're working as a domestic in somebody's house. If a white man slaps you, you can't do anything about it. And you're living life in this horrible ghetto that's overcrowded. Your schools are bad. And then what happens? At the end of the week, you go back to the church and you're still praying and nothing changes for you. But guess what? I have this message from Elijah Muhammad that Islam is the true religion of the Black man. The Black man is not only not a savage, but the Black man is in the image of God, and the white man is a savage. Look how the white man treats you. Look at all the lynchings that happened. Look at what happened to little Emmett Till in Mississippi, beaten for no reason. Look at all the terror that you escaped in the South just to come up to the North and find the same white man doing the same things, just in a different way. This reached a lot of these Black folks, and they listened to Malcolm, and they would join the Nation of Islam. So he was very successful in what he called fishing. He would literally stand outside of churches and wait for people to come out and get folks. So Malcolm is doing this, and he's going all over the country. After he sets up in Harlem, and Harlem becomes his base, he then goes throughout the Midwest. He sets up in 1955, he sets up a temple in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. King's hometown. He helps establish a temple there. Goes as far west as California, San Diego, Los Angeles, setting up temples for Elijah Muhammad. And he's very successful as organizer. Just a map, so you can kind of see where he goes from Boston to Philadelphia to Harlem to Atlanta, throughout the Midwest, back, Michigan, California, all over. Puts something like 30,000 miles on his car in 2 years, traveling, doing the work of establishing the Nation of Islam. And he's incredibly successful. So while he's doing all of that, King, who was just about graduated from getting his PhD from Boston University, gets the job at Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Interesting church, Dexter Avenue, because the pastor before Dr. King, the minister before Dr. King, was a man named Vernon Johns. And Dexter Avenue was kind of a middle-class Black church. They didn't want to cause a whole lot of trouble in Montgomery. And Vernon Johns was an activist minister. Vernon Johns wanted to confront racism in Montgomery. And his parishioners were like, this Vernon Johns guy, he's too much of a troublemaker. He was a rural guy, so he had a farm outside of town. They thought he was a little bit too low class for them. So the middle class Black folks in the church were like, let's get somebody else. So they basically pushed Vernon Johns out of the church, and they said, what about this young guy? He's getting his PhD from Boston University. His father was a minister and one of the big ministers in the South at Ebenezer Church in Atlanta. let's get this Martin Luther King Jr. He's not going to cause any trouble. He's a young guy. He comes from this middle-class background that we all come from. Let's bring him in. So they bring in Dr. King thinking that he's going to be, just a regular pastor, just a regular minister, preach his sermons and make them feel good and all that. But when King comes in, once he gets the job, he flips the script on him. He says, listen, first thing we're going to do, everybody in here needs to get registered to vote. And that's not a small thing in Alabama in 1954. He said, the second thing is, I want everybody in here to join the NAACP, which is, again, not a small thing in Alabama in 1954. He's telling them, we're going to be an activist church. No matter what you thought about what you were bringing me here for, this is what we're going to do. And they had already gotten rid of Vernon Johns, and he was such a good pastor and minister that they were like, all right, well, guess we have to go with these changes. So King establishes himself there. So it's not long that he's there that the bus boycott happens. And now he is put on the stage of history. Because when Rosa Parks is arrested, that night that Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, all the leaders in Black Montgomery get together. And they say, all right, now's the time. We are going to start a boycott. We're not putting up with this type of treatment anymore. We need to organize. We need to organize the community. What are we going to do? And at this meeting, you have people like E.D. Nixon, who was another minister and also a trade union organizer with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who was also the head of the NAACP in Montgomery. He's there. But there's a lot of division among the leaders in Montgomery at the time, the Black leaders in Montgomery, about who should be in charge of this new association, this new movement that they're trying to create. So someone suggests, well, since we all can't agree on who's going to lead, what about the young guy? The guy that just got here. He doesn't have any connections to anybody. He seems to be neutral. Let's get him to be the face of this. So they appoint Dr. King as the leader of this, what becomes the Montgomery Improvement Association. So King at first doesn't want to accept it. He's like, I just got here. I'm new. You all are established leaders. You all have done the work here in Montgomery. I've just got here. And they're like, nah, you can handle it. So that night, King is given the task of, we're going to have a community meeting. We're going to bring the entire community together, and we're going to tell them that we're going to boycott the buses, which was not a small thing. Boycotting the buses meant people are going to have to find alternative ways to get to work, get to school. The buses were the lifeline of the Black community. Black people were the main customers on the Montgomery buses. So to have Black people boycott was asking a lot of them. It was going to affect their safety, because if they were caught boycotting, they could face reprisals from white terrorists. They could face economic reprisals if they're not getting to work, if they don't get to work on time, if they're engaged in the boycott. So many things, so many considerations. So it was going to take a lot of courage, a lot of inspiration needed to keep people off these buses. So King turned to a source for inspiration. And during this time, he would reread this book over and over and over again. It was a book written by the theologian Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman had actually worked at Howard University as a chaplain. He had worked at Boston University. And he had written a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesus and the Disinherited. This book King would read over and over again, because what this book was arguing was this, that Jesus of the Gospels was there to serve the oppressed and not the oppressor. And that it's fine to follow in the footsteps of Jesus to fight against injustice, but doing so nonviolently. That Jesus was here to fight against injustice and to fight against it nonviolently. And this book by Howard Thurman, more than the stuff about Gandhi, and Thurman had met with Gandhi as well, just like King's other mentor, Benjamin Mays, had met with Gandhi in India and talked about how nonviolence could be used to affect political change. So King read Thurman's book over and over and over again, and he was ready to take these tactics that Thurman had advocated and others had advocated for and apply them to the situation in the South. How do you apply nonviolent, direct action to create political change in the South? And what role could the church play in that? Because the NAACP had been in the South and the unions had been in the South, but the church had not been as active as it should have been, according to King, in the struggle for rights. So King wanted to combine the theology of Christ with nonviolent direct action. And he saw in Thurman's book a way to do that. King writes, when I went to Montgomery as pastor, I had not the slightest idea that I would later become involved in a crisis in which nonviolent resistance would be applicable. I neither started the protest nor suggested it. I simply responded to the call of the people for a spokesman. That night, and this is in Stride Toward Freedom, again, Dr. King's book about the Montgomery movement. King wrote a number of books, and so many of us say we know Dr. King, but most of us just know the I Have a Dream speech. Most people don't even know Dr. King wrote books, let alone multiple books. But King's book, Stride Toward Freedom, he says this: more than 40 people from every segment of Negro life were crowded into the large church meeting room. I saw physicians, school teachers, lawyers, businessmen, postal workers, union leaders, and clergymen. Virtually every organization of the Negro community was represented. The largest number there was from the Christian ministry. Having left so many civic meetings in the past, sadly disappointed by the dearth of ministers participating, I was filled with joy when I entered the church and found so many of them there. For then I knew that something unusual was about to happen. So in order to be true to one's conscience and true to God, a righteous man has no alternative but to refuse to cooperate with an evil system. This becomes King's mantra. We see this in his theology. We see this in his activism. You have a moral duty to resist injustice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, King says. He looks at the Bible. He looks at the works of St. Augustine. He looks at the work of St. Paul and others. And he says, this is what has to drive Christianity in the modern times, this fight against injustice and oppression. But it has to be done so in a nonviolent way. So he gives this great speech. But Dr. King is not a superhero. Dr. King is not without his own anxieties and fears. And the night that he has to give this speech to mobilize the Montgomery community to do this very dangerous bus boycott, he doesn't know he can do it. He's struggling to write all the way up until a couple of hours before the actual event. He's thinking, what am I going to say? How am I going to do it? How's this going to come across? He writes, as I thought of the limited time before me and the possible implications of this speech, I became possessed by fear. Each week, I needed at least 15 hours to prepare my Sunday sermon. So think about that. Every week, Dr. King would spend 15 hours just to talk for probably about 3 hours on Sunday. Because he's a new minister, it takes time to become good at public speaking and what you're going to say. But now he only has a few hours to give this major speech that's going to start this movement. I was now almost overcome, obsessed by a feeling of inadequacy. In this state of anxiety, I had already wasted 5 minutes of the original 20. With nothing left but faith in a power whose matchless strength stands over against the frailties and inadequacies of human nature, I turned to God in prayer. My words were brief and simple, asking God to restore my balance and to be with me in a time when I needed his guidance more than ever. And King would go on to give this fabulous speech it's recorded. You can listen to it, where King talks about why they need this bus boycott, what it's going to do, how it's going to spark this change, and how they need to use their faith in God to help them. And it works. Following King's speech, the bus boycott is on. And for months, Black folks in Montgomery do not ride the bus. And all of Black Montgomery is activated. The youth, the students at Alabama State University are activated. You got men's groups that are activated. You got some people that are for the bus boycott, but they're not necessarily for nonviolence the way the King is. So someone recalled in one of the books on King, in Claiborne Carson's book on King, that it was said, and King was not for this violence. King was not advocating this violence. But there were a group of Black men, and in the early stages of the bus boycott, a Black person that went to the bus stop And they saw these brothers there because there were brothers that were out monitoring, make sure that no black people rode the bus. So this black woman asked, excuse me, is this the bus stop? And the brother said, no, she asked, where does the bus stop? And the brother said, well, the bus stop's over there, but then you get your ass beat over there. So tell people, don't ride the buses because we'll mess you up. That was only a small segment of the thing. People weren't intimidated not to ride the buses. Most people did not take the buses because they believed in the cause. They formed carpools. And the city of Montgomery tried to stop this because the bus company then went to the Montgomery city and said, we're losing all this money. You have to force these black folks to get back on the buses. And the city said, okay, well, we're going to pass a law that says there can be no carpools. Because black people had organized. They said, we're going to carpool to get to work, get to school. The city tried to organize that. So King had to fight against that legally and all these things. But ultimately, by the time we get to 1950, the end of 56, it's successful. The bus boycott is successful. And the company says, all right, the practice of forcing black people to go to the back of the bus or to stand up is over. Bus is going to be integrated. And then King said, we also want some black bus drivers too. So that was another thing that they had to negotiate. But this was a big breakthrough. This is the first time in the history of the South that a nonviolent direct action protest boycott had successfully changed a law. And this would open up the floodgates in the South. King realized if we could do this in Montgomery, we can do this other places in the South. And we can use the church as a base to mobilize people. We can do this and we can make this change and we can all do this nonviolently. With this in mind, King organized in January 1957, along with other pastors in the South, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was going to be the organization that King was going to use to bring together his ideas of theology, what the church should be doing, with the actions of everyday people. He was going to bring all these pastors together from throughout the South that shared in his ideas of nonviolence and direct action. They were going to form an organization and they were going to test this theory and this action throughout the South. Two folks that helped him organize this. One, Bayard Rustin, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. Very important figure, lesser known figure in the civil rights movement, but one that we should know. Longtime organizer, longtime freedom fighter, Bayard Rustin. And the other, Miss Ella Baker. Ella Baker had been a longtime organizer with the NAACP, with the cooperatives movement during the Great Depression and other organizations. And she helped King organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Later on, she would have a lot of disagreements with King, not personal, but she didn't like the style of leadership that came with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where you had the ministers at the top, and then they kind of told everybody what to do, and they kind of set the tone. Ella Baker wanted it reversed. She wanted the people to say what the actions of the organization should be and then organize around that. But that comes later on. But at the beginning, her, King, Bayard Rustin, and the other ministers in the South formed this organization to fight for the rights of black folks. And essentially, Ella Baker is actually running the organization. King and the rest of them are kind of like spokesmen. King, raises money for the organization and he speaks and he's the main representative. But running the day-to-day operation of the organization is Miss Ella Baker. And it's founded in Atlanta in 1957. I want to talk about Rustin and I want to talk about the man here, James Baldwin, because these are two figures that are key when we talk about the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle that we don't hear about enough. The reason being, and even during their time, this was one of the main issues, both of these men were homosexuals. Well, James Baldwin said he was bisexual and Bayard Rustin was homosexual. That has allowed these men to be erased in a lot of people's minds from the Black freedom struggle, which is a shame because we wouldn't have gotten as far as we've gotten without these two men. King depended on Bayard Rustin for strategic advisement on what to do. And everybody knew that Bayard Rustin was gay, but they said it's more important. At first, they said it's more important that we get these ideas and we get his organizing. He was one of the key organizers of the March on Washington. He was a key networker and bringing folks together. And it's only when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference leaders and other folks said, King, you need to distance yourself from Bayard Rustin because he's gay, because he possibly might be a communist and these types of things, that they had to push him more toward the background. But he's a key influential figure. James Baldwin was a friend of both Malcolm and Dr. King's. In fact, the first Hollywood movie about the life of Malcolm X, the script was written by James Baldwin. And something I just recently found out, Spike Lee's movie on Malcolm X, the big movie that came out in the early 90s about Malcolm X, most of that script was based off of James Baldwin's script. But for some reason, which I still haven't figured out yet, James Baldwin's family didn't want his name to appear in the credits. But a lot of Spike Lee's script was based off of James Baldwin's script. James Baldwin called Malcolm a friend. Malcolm called James Baldwin a freedom fighter. I bring this up to say there's a lot of folks that like to say that the black freedom struggle shouldn't be associated with people that love differently, that are homosexuals or whatever. But if Martin Luther King could work with Bayard Rustin, if Malcolm X and Dr. King could work with James Baldwin, who are we to say that just because somebody happens to be homosexual or whatever, they can't be involved in the black freedom struggle, or that it's somehow excluded? So I just wanted to bring that up just as an aside as we talk about these two men, because they both valued the input of these two. Spreading Elijah's message. I'll talk about this and then we'll take a break. Malcolm also built alliances with people like James Baldwin. He learned when he was in Harlem from people like Queen Mother Audley Moore and her sister Eloise Moore, who taught Malcolm about Africa as well. So while Malcolm is continues to learn the theology of the Nation of Islam, he's also learning about what's going on in Africa and the importance of Africa and internationally to the freedom struggle. And he's learning that from Eloise Moore and Queen Mother Audley Moore. I'll stop there and we'll come back to this and after our first Q&A. So any questions? Daniel, anything in the chat or any hands up?
There's nothing in the chat. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning, all. I understand that there are three distinct markers. However, Malcolm. However, the fact of the matter, the way I see it, is that the X factor literally eats him alive. And then he went to Mecca, and his message changed to the point that his own seemed to get him.
Yes, we're going to talk about that more next week. But we can see the beginnings of that. We're actually going to talk about it a little bit at the beginning of this week, at the end of this week. But at this time, as Malcolm is organizing, and Malcolm would have been the first to tell you, the members of the Nation of Islam viewed Elijah Muhammad as the messenger of God. And you can't go against the messenger. Just what Malcolm would preach. You can't go against the messenger. Once you're in the Nation of Islam and you've gotten your X, because people would come into the Nation of Islam, and one of the first things they do, it was about completely rehabilitating the person. Your diet would be changed. You're not eating pork anymore. Elijah Muhammad wrote a very influential book called How to Eat to Live. And the stuff that he was talking about in that book, people are just now starting to get on now. Organic farming, intermittent fasting, which is something that people are now starting to do. All of these things. Elijah Muhammad was talking about that in the 40s and 50s. But the members of the Nation of Islam revered Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm did. He writes in the autobiography he adored Elijah Muhammad. In the Latin etymology of the word adorare, like just complete awe of this man. They saw him as God's messenger. So to go against what he was doing, or to go openly go against Elijah Muhammad, would make you an enemy of the Nation of Islam, particularly if you were in it. So when Malcolm does so a couple of years later, he understood what he was doing because he had been preaching that for all these years. But we're going to get into that soon. So
how do we explain the X factor that himself didn't get a hold of? It seemed to drive him crazy, and he didn't seem to get a hold of the X factor at all.
Yeah, we're going to get into it. So it does drive him crazy, but there's some things that happen that we're going to talk about starting the day that kind of get toward that end. Any other questions or comments? Hands? Anything in the chat, Daniel? Okay. I see.
Robin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, brother. Just where's that now? It's like a couple of comments. Because you always get me thinking, man. 1 second. Here we go. So, just what you said about laws mean little if they're not enforced. So the same thing applies to our Federal Employment Equity Act. Right? So the Employment Equity Act that has been around for years has targets. At the moment, it's the groups they use are women, people with disabilities, indigenous people, and visible minorities, which is problematic in itself. But they're not even enforcing those targets. But they haven't been enforcing it, right? So one is, so that's why we're pushing to one, get Black folks designated as a distinct group under the Employment Equity Act, and then to enforce it. And actually, we're actually pushing to get the federal government to appoint a Black equity commissioner, and part of their job would be to ensure things like that actually get enforced, right? Because without the enforcement, it's useless. And then on Audit Coville, that really raises something. Like I heard the story about how the leaders saw that, went, yeah, so that's not the, she's not the perfect. This is not the perfect victim to push forward. And I gotta admit, if I'd been one of the leaders at the time, I would have made the same decision. And unfortunately, what that reflects is that the system kind of demands this like perfect victim, right? And this came up in I was reading Robert Maynard's book recently, Policing Black Lives, where she talks about how Black women, a lot of are often accused of being involved in the sex trade, and the people who come to defend them come along and go, hey, no, they're not like those bad women who are in the sex trade. And Robert Maynard's point is, the women who are in the sex trade aren't bad women. But look at all the factor that led them to being there. This whole idea that kind of this, you get into this perfect victim in order for to justify stuff. And the latest time this came up was in the visit of George Floyd's brother Terrence when he came to Ottawa, like last month or whatever. I was doing some research and looking at some of the stuff that he said, and basically, in some of the stuff he said, he was backing up his narrative, where he basically said, yeah, George used to be a bad guy, but when he was killed, he was a good guy. And then to say, back in the day when he was a bad guy, yeah, we don't care to kill him.
Yeah.
Right? So.
All right. Thank you for those comments. Yeah. So King is now on, because of the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, King is on the national scene. He writes Strive Toward Freedom, the book, talking about it. It gets international and international attention. And then King begins to take this strategy of nonviolent direct action throughout the South, starting in beginning of 57. Malcolm gets on the national scene, particularly in the Northeast, because all this movement that Malcolm has been doing, he's been doing it primarily within Black communities. It's not getting a lot of attention. Black communities know that there's this growing group called the Black Muslims, the Nation of Islam, but white people don't really know much about it. And Malcolm talks about that in the autobiography. He says, in an urban area, if you organize right, you can have an organization of thousands of people, and if you are disciplined, nobody will know about it. And that's what the Nation of Islam was. He had done all of this, building these temples throughout the urban areas of the West, some places in the South, not a lot, but mostly in the North. And he was doing this. But in 1957, we got the incident with Brother Johnson Hinton. Brother Johnson Hinton was in New York, and the police were accosting two other brothers, beating them up, police brutality. And Brother Johnson Hinton, another brother from Nation of Islam, they were there monitoring what the police were doing, attacking these other brothers. And the police told them to disperse. And apparently they didn't move fast enough for the police, so the police started beating Brother Johnson with the baton and basically cracked his skull open and arrested him. Well, people that witnessed this, they knew Brother Johnson was a Muslim, so they ran to the restaurant that the Nation of Islam owned that was near the temple. So you gotta also imagine this. Let me put this in as well. The Nation of Islam was about the black community being as self-sufficient as possible. So in addition to setting up temples, the Nation of Islam also had restaurants. The Nation of Islam had farms. And as Malcolm is setting up this infrastructure, it's growing into a $1 million. It's bringing in millions. It's going to start to bring in millions of dollars by the time we get to the 60s. But at this point, the nation's building restaurants. They're serving good food to black people, healthy food. They have schools. They have clothing industries. They have dry cleaning. So they're building, but they're doing it on the low. They go get Malcolm, who's at the restaurant, and then Malcolm's able to organize 50 brothers from the temple that are in the Fruit of Islam, the paramilitary organization. And they are all in suits, and they march in military formation to the police station to demand information on their brother, on what happened. As these 50 black men in suits, led by Malcolm, are marching to the police station in military formation, the rest of the black people in Harlem were like, what is this? They had never seen anything like that before. Not since the time of Garvey had Harlem seen this military formation of black folks engaged in something like this. So now hundreds of other Harlemites, black Harlemites, start following the Muslims, seeing what's going on. They make their way to the police station. Malcolm goes into the police station. He tells the police officer, we demand to see our brother Johnson. And first the police say, well, he's not here, blah, blah, blah. And then they look out the window and they see the brothers standing in tight military formation. And then they see this growing crowd of black folks surrounding the Muslims demanding action. So the police say, all right, fine, we'll take you to see him. They take him to see Brother Johnson. He's almost dead. Had they not gone there, Brother Johnson would have died. He's in a cell with his head cracked open, not receiving medical attention. So then Malcolm says, I demand that this man be treated at a hospital. So they transfer him to the hospital that's about 15 blocks away from the police station. And then Malcolm marches the Fruit of Islam to the hospital to make sure that he gets there safely and that he's being seen by a doctor. And then the rest of Harlem follows the brothers to the hospital. Now, the police go to Malcolm and they're saying, you need to disperse this crowd. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's your problem, because the Nation of Islam, we're fine. They're in formation. They haven't harmed anybody. They haven't done anything. They're a tight military crew. You are responsible for those people. And the police are like, we can't do anything about these people. You need to disperse them. So Malcolm disperses the Nation of Islam with a wave of his finger. The men are, do an about face. They turn around and they go. And the people of Harlem go. But this happening, and ultimately, though, Brother Johnson receives a settlement from the state of New York, because the Nation of Islam gets him a lawyer, it helps him sue, and he gets one of the largest, at the time, the largest settlement for police brutality that the state of New York ever had to give someone. So that's a victory, and this put Malcolm on the national stage, because people in Harlem had never seen anything like this, and black people in the United States had not seen anything like this in recent times. So the Brother Johnson incident in 1957 gets Malcolm an incredible amount of press, gets the Nation of Islam an incredibly amount of press, because now black people all over the country are saying there's an organization where you got brothers that are standing up like this, that are confronting the police. And just like King, there's no violence associated. He did this non-violently. Malcolm always said, we're not a violent organization. We're not necessarily doing the nonviolent direct action tactics that King is doing. We're not out here to hurt nobody. But if attacked, yes, we will defend ourselves. That's what he always said. So this gets him national attention. So Malcolm is able to take this attention, build alliances with people like I said, James Baldwin, other organizations in Harlem, Eloise Moore, Queen Mother Moore, other organizations. He also becomes a columnist, just like his mother. Just like his mother wrote for the Negro World, for Garvey's organization, Malcolm understood the power of the press, and he becomes a columnist. In the black newspaper in New York, the New Amsterdam News, and in the Los Angeles Daily Herald, both black newspapers, he publishes an article called God's Angry Men. And this would run for about 2 years, from 57 to 58, where he spread the message of Elijah Muhammad through the newspaper, through newspaper columns. And these columns will also be picked up by other black newspapers throughout the country as well. So Malcolm is just like his mother, just like his father. He's an organizer like his father. He's a writer like his mother. He eventually helps start Muhammad Speaks, which is the Nation of Islam's own newspaper, which again functioned a lot like Garvey's Negro World. It was a paper designed for the black community that talked about things going on in Africa, things going on in America, and it was just like the Negro World and understand these tactics of organizing. So Malcolm X writes a column. How many people knew that Malcolm X was a writer, was a journalist, was a columnist? Same thing with King. Both of these men were writers. King writes his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, which was about the bus boycott and the philosophy behind the bus boycott. King also starts a column a little bit later on, 1962, called People in Action. Again, in the Amsterdam News, the same newspaper that published Malcolm's column. So both of these men were columnists. They were writers. You know, it's important for us to look at these men not just as people that gave speeches, not just as people that were giving interviews on TV, but they were writers, they were organizers, and it's important to read what they write so we can get a fuller picture of their philosophies and their ideas at the time. So if you get a chance, read these things. It's also in 1958 that while promoting this book, Stride Toward Freedom, that Dr. King almost left us a lot earlier, 10 years earlier than he did. Dr. King was stabbed in his chest in 1958 by a black woman, actually. This woman had some severe mental health challenges, and he's at a bookstore signing his book, and she comes in and she asked, are you Dr. King? And I think she said something about the NAACP, and she pulls out a letter opener, and she stabs Dr. King in the chest. Dr. King was so close to death that the doctors told him had he would have sneezed, that letter opener would have cut the artery to his heart, and he would have died. That's how close he was to death. But luckily for us, he didn't die. You can see in this image, you can see the letter opener sticking out of his chest. And you can see how calm he is. But look very closely at that picture. You can see it sticking out of his chest where he got stabbed. So King recovers from that, and he continues his activism. Let me put this in context. This is Dr. King a little bit after he got stabbed. This is in Canada. This is a CBC interview with Dr. King, young Dr. King. He's only 30 years old, giving this interview about the civil rights movement. I will go fast forward. So that is one of Dr. King's first international appearances. That's in Canada. And I loved his answer. He said, there's a difference between desegregation and integration. You know, we can change the laws, but for people to actually start interacting with each other, he said, probably not till the end of this century. And it's 2023. We still not even anywhere close to that. But anyway, Malcolm would also begin to use the media more to spread Elijah Muhammad's message as well. He would go on radios. He would debate James Baldwin in 1961. He would go on American television. He would go on radio. But most importantly, probably the most significant event was when Malcolm was, and the Nation of Islam was profiled on a 1959 television documentary called "The Hate That Hate Produced," and it's hosted by Mike Wallace, who's become famous for being on 60 Minutes. And I'm not going to play the whole thing, but it's posted on our course website. You can watch this. This is the first time that the nation, that the United States as a whole, white folks really learn about the Nation of Islam and what it's about. And Malcolm is featured very prominently on this. I just want to play a little bit of it. See you next week. All right. Well, you kind of got a taste of how both men used the press to spread their messages, and they were both very successful. Um, by the time we get to 1962, both of these men have become incredibly prominent, and the movement is growing around them. The movement is becoming more militant. King's more militant, which it is militant, nonviolent direct action is incredibly militant, has now gotten new troops. It's not just about the church, but in 1960, we started to see the sit-in movement. The young black college students starting in North Carolina begin sitting in and refusing to leave until they're served at lunch counters and different things. This transforms into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they are using the tactics of King, the nonviolent direct action, in order to get change. The freedom rides are starting, where integrated students from the North are coming into the South and testing the accommodations on buses and in bus stations and fighting for change in the South. So the students are activated now. The students are in this struggle. King is now leading the many of the Christians, and not all black Christian churches are with King. A lot of them consider him a troublemaker, but the progressive churches are with King. And he's going throughout these towns in the South, in Florida, and different places, and desegregating. He's spending a lot of time in jail, being arrested for these demonstrations and these things. So King is doing all of this work and is getting attention every time he goes into a town and the people are brutalized and attacked. King's house in Montgomery is bombed. Actually, I forgot to mention that during the bus boycott. His house is bombed. Luckily, he wasn't home, and his wife and children weren't home, but it was bombed. And another thing about King, and if you go to the Black Museum in Montgomery in Alabama, you can see this. When King's house got bombed, the first thing that Dr. King went and did was go get himself a gun license. Dr. King was going to get a gun so he could protect his family. He later on didn't actually go buy the gun. He felt better. He said, I need to maintain the nonviolence. But King had the same instinct that many of us would have, that Malcolm and them would say, if someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. So King thought about that at first, but he decided against it. But King is facing all these threats. People are being brutalized and students are being attacked for the sit-in movement. And while all this is happening, now Malcolm more so than King, is starting to critique King. But as King becomes more prominent, Malcolm is attacking the method and the idea that nonviolence is the way. And that if you're attacked, you should just turn the other cheek and take it. Malcolm is kind of miscategorizing King's position. Malcolm is presenting King's position as pacifism, and King said that's not necessarily the case. What we have is we're using nonviolent direct action for change. We're not, we're resisting, we're just not resisting with violence. Malcolm is presenting King as he's telling black people to not defend themselves at all, and that's not necessarily what King is saying. So all this is happening, and that's Malcolm's major critique of King, is this whole idea of turning the other cheek. This is going to become an issue for Malcolm. And this is going to lead to what Mr. Thomas brought up earlier, ultimately lead to the split between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. Now, you saw in that video footage how Malcolm opened up for Elijah Muhammad, how he was a national spokesman for the Nation of Islam, how a man who was released from prison in 1952 helped build that organization that you see in that footage from 1959. 7 years later, that organization went from a handful of people between Detroit and Chicago to now filling up stadiums. And a lot of that was due to the work of Malcolm X. Not solely, there were other people in the nation doing work, but a lot of that was from the charisma and the organizational capabilities of Malcolm X. But he's eventually going to split. And part of that split with the Nation of Islam starts with this incident in Los Angeles, California, the Brother Stokes betrayal. In California, Los Angeles, you had Temple number 27, one that Malcolm had helped establish. And Brother Ronald Stokes was the secretary of that temple. Well, one day, a couple of the brothers that were associated with that temple, they owned a dry cleaning business. as you saw in that video, the nation owned a number of different businesses, department stores, different things. They wanted black folks to be self-sufficient. So they would do the laundering for people at the temple, and they would pick up their laundering and they would drop it off at their home. But sometimes if they couldn't catch them at their houses, they knew that the people would be at the temple, so they would just bring the clothes to the temple. Well, as they pulled up in their car to bring the dry clean clothes to the people in the temple, the police see them taking the clothes out of the car, and the police officers assume that the Muslims are selling stolen clothes, boosted clothes, and they accost them, and the Muslims fight the police back. And the Los Angeles police, and let me give you this caveat. The Los Angeles police and the police in California, in places where black folks live. Now you need this background because it makes it make more sense. In California, in San Diego, and other places in California, black folks had migrated there during World War II in large numbers to work in those war industries, to work in the Navy yards and those types of places that supplied the arms and things for the troops fighting in the Pacific and all that. So there was a big employment recruitment, labor recruitment done in the South, in places like Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi, to get black people to go to California to work in these industries. At the same time, the Californians also recruited white Southern police officers from Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi to police this growing black population. They deliberately recruited racist white Southern police officers to police black folks in California. So the LAPD were notorious even back then for police brutality against black folks and also against Mexican Americans. So when the police stop these brothers outside of the temple, they get into a scuffle. Now, the brothers aren't armed, if the police are, but the two police officers are losing the fight. So they call in hundreds of other police officers, emerge on the scene, and they start rounding up the Muslims, and then they start shooting. And in the process, Brother Ronald Stokes is killed by the police officers. He's unarmed with his hands up. Because he comes out of the temple to see what's going on, and the police shoot him. The police then raid the temple. They go in, they force everybody to strip. They search the place for weapons. They basically desecrate the temple. So one of Malcolm's friends, Ronald Stokes, the secretary of the temple, is killed. A number of other people are wounded. One brother is shot and he's paralyzed for the rest of his life. And the temple has been disgraced and people have been brutalized. Malcolm is furious. Malcolm wants revenge because this is 1962. So from 1954 to 1962, Malcolm has been going around as a columnist in the media, in his speeches saying, in the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad teaches us that we have the right to defend ourselves from attack. And if we're attacked, we have the right to strike back. But go back to something I mentioned in week 1, and even what was mentioned in that video. Elijah Muhammad had served time in the federal penitentiary. Elijah Muhammad did not want the United States government to focus too much of its attention, which it already had started doing. The FBI was all throughout the Nation of Islam, surveilling the Nation of Islam and everything. But Elijah Muhammad did not want to go back to jail. He did not want the Nation of Islam to become a target of the United States government. So he told Malcolm and the other ministers, stand down, don't do anything. Do not respond, do not physically respond to what happened in Los Angeles. Because what Malcolm wanted to do, he wanted the FOI, the Fruit of Islam, to use all its martial arts and military training to start attacking the police. You attacked us, now we're attacking you. This is what he had been preaching throughout this entire time. He doesn't want to look like a hypocrite to the rest of the black community. Because the rest of the black community is saying, okay, well, they just attacked you. They raided your temple. They stripped your people naked. They brutalized them. They killed one of your members. What you going to do about it? You've been talking this big game. You've been talking about how Dr. King is a pacifist and nonviolence and all this. What you going to do about it? So Malcolm was hamstrung. He couldn't do anything because he had to listen to what Elijah Muhammad said. Elijah Muhammad said, stand down, don't do anything. So this is starting to sow the seeds for Malcolm that, maybe I might be better served outside of the Nation of Islam to do the things that need to be done for liberation. It's just a little tiny seed. This is going to get bigger in 1963, but this is where it starts, where Malcolm is disappointed in the fact that he has to now do all this mental gymnastics and kind of talk to the black people that are legitimately asking, well, what are you going to do? You said that y'all was about this life and y'all was going to do this, that, and the third, but what happened? So Malcolm is dealing with that. It's kind of a setback for Malcolm. King has his own setback. These are just images of the funeral, Ronald Stokes' funeral, and then Malcolm went on a huge campaign, national campaign, about talking about police brutality and so many other places. And again, this message still resonates in 2023. We talk about police killings of black men, but the Nation of Islam was big on that. King had his own setback in 61, 62 as well. The Albany setback. So up until this point, from the Montgomery bus boycott to 62, King, now alongside with the students, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, have been putting this direct action, nonviolent direct action protests and boycotts and sit-ins and marches, and has been very successful getting attention and changing things throughout the South. Getting, water fountains and desegregation actually enforced. Because what King would do, King would go into a town, they would have a demonstration. Usually the police or other white terrorist groups would attack the people. They would resist non-violently. They might get arrested. Some people might get killed, brutalized, and it would make international news. And now the federal government of the United States, as we're moving into the Kennedy administration and the end of the Eisenhower, beginning of the Kennedy administration, they have to, again, they're looking over the shoulder. The Soviet Union is saying, see, every time you all are in the news, these black people in the South are being brutalized and attacked. This is showing that America is not the democracy that it says it is. So the federal government is putting pressure on the South and saying, hey, you need to clean this up. You need to change these laws. You're starting to make the country look bad. And every time you attack these black people, we're getting this negative attention internationally. So you got to figure this thing out. So King relied on that. He knew that the nonviolent direct action would encounter resistance, fierce resistance from the white Southerners, and then that would amplify the situation and then change what happened, hopefully. Well, in Albany, Georgia, where they wanted to desegregate a couple of places, public transportation places, some other things in Albany, Georgia, there was a sheriff named Lori Pritchard. And Lori Pritchard was not like the other low-class cracker sheriffs that Martin Luther King interacted with. And I use cracker, I'm saying it not as necessarily just a derogatory term toward all white people. I'm talking about there's a particular type of Southerner that prided themselves on brutalizing black folks. That's where the term cracker comes from, the crack of the whip. It has nothing to do with like saltine crackers or anything. It's about cracking a whip. So most of the sheriffs were either in the Klan or in white terrorist organizations, and they couldn't wait to brutalize black people. Lori Pritchard, however, read Dr. King's book, Stride Toward Freedom. He read his playbook. He knew that what King wanted was to come into Albany, Georgia, get the attention, and then push for change that way. So what Lori Pritchard did, he used nonviolence against the nonviolence people. The nonviolent activists come in. He told his officers, I want you to arrest these people with the least amount of violence possible. Just calmly arrest them, put them in jail. Don't brutalize them. Don't engage with them. Just arrest them, put them in jail. That's all we're going to do. We're going to be very simple about this. No fire hoses, no dogs, no sticks, nothing like that. Just arrest them as non-violently as possible. Well, when this happened and King couldn't get the attention for the Albany movement as he wanted, people eventually got tired of getting arrested. They got tired of not getting the media attention of anything. And ultimately, they had to leave Albany, Georgia without the changes that they wanted to make. The movement failed because Lori Pritchard was able to use King's own tactics against him. So at the end of 1962, going into 63, King is at a low point because now he's trying to question whether the nonviolence can work without the violent reaction of white law enforcement officers and white public officials. So King is trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the next place that we can do this strategy? And he zeroes in on Birmingham, Alabama. And this is going to be the place where King really puts the nonviolent direct action movement in practice. This is going to be the place where he delivers, or he creates one of the great theological and philosophical texts of our time, the letter from Birmingham jail. It's going to be the place where, if you think about civil rights footage of fire hoses and dogs, a lot of that is coming out of Birmingham, because he's going to encounter a law enforcement officer in Bull Connor who's the exact opposite of Lori Pritchard, who can't wait to put a beating down on black folks. And this is what King needed. It's the type of adversary that King needed. But that's going to be 1963. 1963 is also the year that Malcolm and King interact more with each other in terms of going back and forth in the press about each other, mostly Malcolm going at King. King never really went at Malcolm that much. And 1963 is also going to be the year that Malcolm leaves the Nation of Islam and has that break at the end of 1963. But we're going to talk about 1963 as a whole next week. Next week is just about pretty much 1963, because it's such a pivotal year for both men that we're going to get into that all of next week. So next week, we're going to start with Chickens Coming Home to Roost and Insufficient Funds. We're going to talk about two of the great speeches of the 20th century, the Ballad of the Bullet, as well as King's I Have a Dream speech. So that will be our discussion for next week. So everyone, thank you for listening. We'll open it up for questions, comments, and announcements at this time, and we'll close up. So thank you for listening. Daniel, anything in the chat or any questions, any hands?
There is a question in the chat. Somebody asked, did Frantz Fanon have any appreciable influence on either Malcolm X or Dr. King?
Not that we know of, at least with Malcolm. One of the reasons being, when Fanon was operating in Algeria, a lot of now King knew about Algeria. I'm not sure if King knew a lot. Both of them knew about Algeria and the struggle going on in Algeria. But the writings of Fanon didn't get translated into English until either right before Malcolm died or right after. So King may have had some